Rob Caskie, proudly telling stories. I'm standing this morning in the beautiful Natal Midlands after the remarkable rains that we've had, creating such havoc in the greater Durban area and on both coastlines adjacent to Durban. Behind me down the valley is the beautiful, beautiful Albert Falls Dam that is fed by the Umgani River, which in turn is fed from Midmar Dam, which supplies much of the Midlands, creating great water security in this part of the world, for which we are very thankful. But I wanted to share with you a little, if I may, the remarkable experiences and places that storytelling has taken us to. I was not long ago lucky enough to be invited to talk in both Hong Kong and Singapore at their local Royal Geographical Societies, along with some of the businesses in those two magnificent cities. Now, the heat and the humidity has always been quite difficult for me out in Southeast Asia, but the very kind organizer of our talks organized for Karen and I to fly back business class on Cathay Pacific, and I've got to tell you that any thought of heat and humidity flying back in that magnificent part of the aircraft removed any previous doubts that we may have had about the heat and the humidity. It's interesting too that one of the beautiful Oppenheimer granddaughters invited me to talk at her post-wedding ceremony up at Pafuri in the northern Kruger Park, and we're going to have the function and the dinner on the airstrip. Now, talking to 120 people out of doors in the open alongside of an airstrip is quite tricky, but I'm pleased to tell you that lions and hyenas came onto the airstrip. I think they were attracted by the smell of the beautiful meat being cooked. They never harassed us in any way, but it really was quite a magnificent scene with the African sky and stars overhead, 120 people sitting in front of me and talking about some of the stories I've been lucky enough to share. I asked Rachel what story she wanted told, and she said the story of Isantlawana, which always is particularly poignant and moving, particularly being told at night. And then, of course, quite recently, I was fortunate enough to be invited by my dear friend Alistair Campbell to do a talk down in Kenton-on-Sea. Now, Kenton-on-Sea on the Cape Coast is a place I don't know at all, and I certainly didn't know that there were many people living there. And it was Alistair's birthday, and he wanted me to do a talk about Shackleton and the Shackleton whiskey for his birthday. And it turned out that he ended up with 25 people at his beautiful home for that dinner function. And he said he was going to organize another function the following night to aid Round Table in their fundraising efforts. And the following night we had 60 people. The venue couldn't cope with any more, with the proceeds going to Round Table. Alistair had very cleverly got the cheapest price of Shackleton replica whiskey from Norman Goodfellows, and then challenged Checkers Liquor if they could match it, which they did. And he bought 30 bottles of the liquor, added 100 Rand to the sale price, and we sold all 30 bottles at the function, and that money too went to Round Table. I was fortunate enough to go and talk at the Wild Coast Sun for a crane company. Now, the Wild Coast Sun has been through various metamorphoses since it was first built. It is still a magnificent place, enormous, enormous resort, just over the Umzimvubu River in what is the old Transkei, just south of the southern Natal border. And it was a wonderful function talking to these gentlemen who in their daily life deal with cranes and large numbers of labor and the challenges in the crane industry. On my trip back from Antarctica, we were lucky enough to visit Tristan da Cunha, which I believe is the most remote inhabited island in the world. There are 4 islands in that little group. We weren't allowed to land on account of COVID, but did wonderful ship cruising and zodiac cruising around the islands and saw their little settlement rather ostentatiously named Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, since the Duke of Edinburgh visited there in 1857. It reminded me too of visiting King William Island in the Northwest Passage, where the ships Erebus and Terror were found in 2014 and 2016 respectively. Those ships had gone down in 1848 with John Franklin and his 128 of the finest of the Royal Navy searching for the elusive link in the Northwest Passage. And what a story that turned out to be, where the men ended up resorting tragically to cannibalism just to survive. And of course, on King William Island, on the other side of the island, is that little place called Joahaven, where the Joa, which was that 47-ton boat taken by Roald Amundsen through the Northwest Passage successfully in the years 1903 to 1906. He took his little ship into this tiny little bay with a very narrow entrance and ended up being iced in there for 2 winters, where he learnt about building igloos and all about the local customs of the Inuit people, and importantly how they dealt with dogs, how they dealt with sleds, and most importantly how they dealt with the cold, especially their use of wild animal skins for clothing. So what a wonderful, wonderful experience it was to see the island on both sides. The side of the island on the more northwesterly aspect, where the ships were indeed crushed and sunk by the ice in shallow water, and the southeasterly aspect where Joahaven is, where the Joa was anchored and safely kept out of ice's way for 2 seasons. And I've always been intrigued and quite overwhelmed, in fact, in this storytelling career at the kindness and the generosity of locals, how they open their hearts and their homes to us all over the world, but particularly in England. One of my favorite talks was done in a farm barn surrounded by tractors and combine harvesters and bales of hay on little dusty plastic chairs. The people on a wonderful summer's English evening sat outside having a glass of wine and then came in for the talk. And it was one of those evenings that just stands out for one, along with talking regularly at Shumungwe Lodge, which is a beautiful lodge named after the Battalier eagle in the Thornybush Game Reserve, where I've been fortunate enough to go with varsity friends for special celebrations, and on 3 occasions they've asked me to tell various stories there. I often give the host the choice as to what story they would like to hear, and we've always had the most fantastic evenings, followed by much banter and of course much spirit-rich cheers in that beautiful, beautiful part of South Africa. A wonderful gentleman called Rattray was on a ship with me in Antarctica, and he could recite incredibly long poems verbatim, and he was always pleased with my storytelling ability and invited me to come and share stories with his family and clients at his beautiful home in Bishop's Court. And what an evening we had, sitting in a large glass conservatory sharing stories of Shackleton, along with some whiskey tasting of the Shackleton replica whiskey. And what a standout evening it turned out to be. He said it was one of the finest client events he'd ever hosted. And then, of course, you've heard in my previous talks the remarkable evening we had at Chelmsford at the police headquarters, where the helicopters blowing all the grass into the venue, into the policemen's drinks, the policemen covering their drinks to try and stop them being filled with grass cuttings and so forth. And the wonderful cars we've hired on these trips, from little Fiat 500s to Ford Escorts and Ford Fiestas. And then on one occasion we'd booked a small basic car and it wasn't ready for us, and I'm afraid I lost my sense of humour, having just flown in from South Africa, and there was a wonderful lady manning the counter from the West Indies, and I don't think she'd ever seen a white South African in such a rage. And they upgraded us to a VW Touareg. Now, Karen and I have never really travelled in a VW Touareg. It's one of our dream cars, and we were able to drive 800 miles all over the UK in a beautiful silver VW Touareg, with Karen practicing her royal wave. We were anxious about the impression it gives to clients when you arrive in a car of that sort, because I think that most of them felt that they were paying us far too much to tell stories that we could afford to hire a car of that sort. And as I reflect on this journey and the times and the experiences that I've had now in 22 years of storytelling, I've always been stunned at how folks open their minds, their hearts, their homes to us. And I'm also convinced that more and more we create our own luck and create our own good fortune by hopefully establishing a philosophy of integrity and decency with the folks we deal with. And I've always wanted folks to know that my word is my bond in terms of our interactions and our transactions with the telling of these stories. Very recently, a dear friend from Sedgefield, Mark Collins, arranged with his gorgeous sister Jean to offer a surprise to Jean's husband, Mark's brother-in-law, Murray, and they were going to organise a storytelling evening at their game farm up in the Waterberg. Now the Waterberg is northwest of Pretoria, and in fact overlooks basically the Botswana border. So we drove up there. We met up with one of the brother-in-law's good friends en route. He was also going to surprise his good friend, and our vehicles were hidden away on the game farm, and we were driven around to a little cave where we had to hide. And Mark Collins had said he would bring his brother-in-law and the rest of the party out from the lodge, and they were going to have drinks at this favorite sundowner spot called the Windpomp, where there's an old windmill, and he would give a code word which meant that I was going to surprise them with shouting something in Zulu and appearing out of the cave. And Karen and Andrew and I were sitting in this little cave, and when the code word came, I shouted, "Sumbayeti masimpiti kingindawo. Awubonanga nje bayenza kanjani lapha esandlwane. Baqhumukile bonke, baqaqekile bonke. Bazoyenza njalo nawe. Bayeti inkosi." Now the fellow for whom the function had been planned knew nothing about it. He is a young manager on the farm who hails from Pietermaritzburg, and his initial thought was, goodness me, my manager Zulu's coming along well. He didn't know he had such a strong voice. Karen nearly jumped out of his skin when I shouted. It was somewhat unexpected, and I appeared from this cave in my standard storytelling outfit and greeted the man for whom the surprise had been arranged. He'd never met me. He was simply staggered. My name is on my shirt, and he was even more staggered when he realized that every single person in the group knew of the surprise except him, and he didn't want any surprise for his 50th. It was a quite magnificent time, and in true bushveld fashion, we had wonderful, wonderful soaking rain all night, reminding us of the bounty of this beautiful land and the dichotomy indeed of Africa, because rhino poaching in their part of the world is a very real daily issue. I hope you've enjoyed a few little reminiscences of mine, of storytelling, the venues it's taken me to, some of the experiences we've had, and I hope you will continue to support me on the storytelling journey. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.